Hello, everyone. Throughout the long course of human history, there have been thousands of kings and hundreds of emperors. Yet, in the more than 2,000 years that have passed, only one man has been honored by later generations with a title that transcends all others, a title consisting of just two simple yet sacred words: the Great Emperor. His name was Alexander the Great, a name forever intertwined not only with resounding victories and glorious conquests, but also with the symbol of an unyielding will, a burning ambition, and a dream so immense, so audacious, that it seemed to surpass the very limits of what it means to be human. At the age of 20, Alexander ascended the throne, inheriting both a kingdom and a destiny. By the age of 30, he had brought under his command nearly all the lands that were known to the civilized world of his era. And by the age of 32, he had triumphed over every rival power from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea to the banks of the Indus River, from the deserts of Egypt to the far-reaching highlands of Central Asia. From the day he wore the crown until the moment he drew his final breath at 33, during 12 brief yet monumental years of reign, he never once suffered defeat in battle. Each campaign he led carved his legend deeper into the heart of history, transforming him, even while still alive, into a living myth, a symbol of both greatness and glory. He was the first man in the history of the Western world who dared to venture beyond the familiar boundaries of the Mediterranean, leaving behind the lands of Greece and Macedonia to march across scorching deserts, towering mountains, raging rivers, and foreign civilizations utterly strange to his own. With every step, he declared not merely conquest, but a belief that the entire world should stand united under a single empire and be ruled by one supreme king. To those who revered him, Alexander was not a mere mortal. He was seen as a god in human form, a man who embodied the wisdom of Greek philosophy, the ideals of Aristotle, the courage and fiery heart of Achilles, and the far-seeing eyes of a visionary capable of gazing beyond the horizon of his own age. Yet, for those unfortunate enough to face the sharp edge of his sword, Alexander was no divine savior. To them, he was a destroyer, the one who turned prosperous cities into ashes, who trampled upon the bodies of countless souls to satisfy his insatiable thirst for domination and eternal fame. He was the man who ordered the slaughter of soldiers who had already laid down their arms simply because they dared to defy or refuse his authority. Alexander stood as both the radiant embodiment of glory and the haunting shadow cast by the boundless ambition he so relentlessly pursued. So who was Alexander truly? Was he a Greek god who had lost his way in a mortal world? Or merely a young boy burdened with the dream of ruling all mankind, a dream so heavy that even he could not bear its weight? Was he a military genius whose strategies shaped the art of warfare for centuries to come, or merely a tempest of history, a storm that swept through a fragile world and left behind both splendor and ruin? Was he the man who opened the path for Greek civilization to spread far and wide, or was he simply the conqueror who used sword and spear to force others into accepting his own ideals? And in the end, was he truly the conqueror of the world, or perhaps the greatest victim of his own endless dream, a dream with no end and no peace? Today I respectfully invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to join me as we journey back in time into the life, the triumphs, and the tragedy of the man remembered as the greatest conqueror in history. Alexander the Great, the man who turned the world into a vast battlefield map, and who, in doing so, transformed himself into a legend that time could never erase. Alexander the Great was born on July 20th, 356 BC, in the city of Pella, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedonia. He was the son of King Philip II, one of the most remarkable monarchs of the ancient Greek world, a man who transformed a backward, underestimated Macedonia, once despised by the sophisticated city-states like Athens and Sparta, into the greatest military power of its time. Philip was not only a brilliant strategist, but also a shrewd and ambitious statesman. He desired to pass on to his son every ounce of knowledge, wisdom, and experience he had accumulated, everything necessary to rule and to conquer. Yet it was his mother, Olympias, who planted within Alexander's heart something that could not be taught by politics or war, a belief in a divine destiny, a conviction that his life was guided by the will of the gods. Olympias came from the royal line of Molosia, a family deeply devoted to ancient myths and religious fervor. She was a priestess of the cult of Dionysus, and she firmly believed that Alexander was not the child of a mortal man, but a descendant of the gods themselves. It was said that before Alexander was born, she dreamed of a thunderbolt striking her womb, a sign she believed to be a manifestation of Zeus, the king of the gods. She held that dream sacred, and she raised her son to believe in it too. From the moment of his birth, Alexander was not raised merely as a prince, but as a chosen one, a being destined for greatness beyond the realm of ordinary men. He grew up surrounded by swords and scrolls, in a world filled with ancient books, weapons, and tales of heroism. Each night, instead of hearing fairy tales like other children, he listened to stories of Achilles, Heracles, Perseus, the immortal warriors of Greek legend. And within the tender heart of the young boy, a seed began to sprout. If the world once had Achilles, then why could it not one day have an Alexander? In his childhood, Alexander was a curious and complex child, intelligent to the point of coldness, decisive to the point of strangeness, and often deeply lonely. Even at an early age, he displayed an unyielding independence, refusing to accept anything simply because adults told him so. He always asked why, and if the answer did not satisfy him, he would seek the truth on his own terms. One day, King Philip brought home a massive black stallion named Bucephalus. The horse was wild and untamable. No one at court could control it, for it reared and fought violently at every attempt to mount it. Yet the 12-year-old Alexander stepped forward and asked for permission to try. Before the astonished eyes of the entire court, the boy did not use the whip nor brute force. Instead, he gently turned the horse towards the sun, so that it would no longer be frightened by its own shadow. In that moment, the mighty stallion calmed, and Alexander mounted it effortlessly, riding it with the grace of a god carried by the wind. From that day on, Bucephalus became his loyal companion, not just a horse, but a brother in arms, fighting alongside him in countless battles all the way to the distant plains of Punjab. But sword and horse alone do not make a great emperor. King Philip, who knew that a true ruler must possess not only strength, but also intellect, decided to seek out the greatest mind of his time. Aristotle, the philosopher who would later shape the foundations of Western thought. He invited him to become the personal tutor of his 13-year-old son. Thus began the most extraordinary education in history. Under Aristotle's guidance, the young prince of Macedonia learned not only ethics, philosophy, mathematics, and science, but also how to think like a ruler, how to view the world as a unified, logical whole, and how to understand human nature as inseparable from politics and culture. Alexander absorbed knowledge like a sponge thirsting for water. He read every manuscript Aristotle provided, delving into medicine, astronomy, geography, history, and philosophy. Above all, he developed a deep passion for Homer's epics, especially the Iliad, which he carried with him on every military campaign, as both a manual of war and a guide to life. Unlike most kings who were raised merely to reign, Alexander was raised to seek immortality. He truly believed that he was destined not only to inherit his father's throne, but also to fulfill a divine mission bestowed upon him by the gods themselves. At that time, Macedonia was an emerging power, yet it was still not recognized by the Greek world as a truly civilized nation. The proud city-states like Athens regarded the Macedonians as crude and barbaric. To the east, the Persian Empire remained the grandest force of the ancient world, wealthy, vast, and proud, with the memory of once having invaded Greece still burning in its history. The world in those days was divided into rival powers, each arrogant and fearful of the others, locked in a tense and uneasy balance, ready to clash, but restrained by caution. And it was within this fragile void of history that a boy born of a warrior's blood, a philosopher's mind, and a god's ambition began to grow, a child destined to change the world forever. When Alexander was only 16 years old, King Philip II temporarily left Macedonia to conquer another land. Instead of appointing a regent, he gave full authority to govern the country to his son, a decision that few kings would dare to make with a child not yet 17. But Alexander did not disappoint. While Philip was away, a tribe in the region of Thrace rebelled. Instead of sitting in the palace waiting for reports, Alexander personally led the army to suppress the rebellion. Not only did he quickly restore order, but he also built a city there and named it Alexandropolis, the city of Alexander, as an early declaration of the imperial stature he dreamed of. However, his first true victory, and the one that made Alexander's name begin to echo across the Greek city-states, was in 338 BC at the Battle of Chaeronea. At that time, an alliance of Greek city-states, especially Athens and Thebes, the cradles of ancient civilization, united to resist Macedonia's expansion. They saw Philip as a rude northern barbarian, and Alexander as a child not yet grown. Their greatest mistake was underestimating a young man who had been raised with both the sword and the books of Aristotle. In that battle, 18-year-old Alexander commanded the Macedonian cavalry. While the veteran generals were caught in a stalemate, he delivered the decisive blow against Thebes' elite forces, destroying the Sacred Band, the most elite army of the alliance, considered invincible. It is said that Alexander was the first to charge into the enemy formation, personally leading the cavalry, cutting down lines of soldiers, not recklessly, but with cold calculation and tactical vision beyond his age. After his strike, the alliance's formation broke apart, Athens fled, Thebes was crushed, and under King Philip's command, Macedonia completed the process of controlling all of Greece. After the battle, King Philip, who was known for his arrogance, embraced his son in front of the army and said, "O people of Greece, look upon my son, look upon the one who will surpass even me." It was not a casual compliment, but the words of a proud and haughty father who had to admit that this son was born to rule the world. After the Battle of Cheroneia, Alexander was no longer just a prince. He became the irreplaceable heir, a new symbol of Macedonian strength, a fresh wind blowing away the old dust of the decaying Greek city-states. And there was one thing few people realized. His first victory was not to defend Macedonia, but to destroy the most ancient and respected symbols of Greek civilization, Athens and Thebes. Was that a sign that Alexander was born not to preserve the old order, but to erase it? That within him, tradition and myth, knowledge and fire, Greece and the foreign world were all blending together, forming a man who did not belong to any culture but sought to conquer them all? Perhaps that is why, right after the battle, Alexander began to be more than just a prince. In the eyes of others, and perhaps even in his own heart, he had already become a future king carrying on his shoulders the entire Greek world and an ambition that reached far beyond its borders. In 336 BC, King Philip II was assassinated at Aigi during the wedding of his daughter. The death happened as quickly as a knife strike, but the political shock it left behind was like an earthquake. All of Macedonia was shaken. The enemies of the royal family immediately rose up. The Greek city-states, which had seemed subdued, began to discuss rebellion again, and the nobles in the court started to divide into factions, waiting for a chance to seize the throne. Amidst the storm of power, Alexander, then only 20 years old, ascended the throne with the eyes of a man who showed no sign of fear. He did not weep before his father's body, nor did he show confusion in front of the suspicious gazes around him. Instead, he acted swiftly, decisively, and without the slightest hesitation. Within only a few weeks, all those believed capable of overthrowing him were either arrested or executed. The princes who conspired to seize the throne were put to death, and even a half-brother was personally eliminated by Alexander himself. The stepmother, whom many suspected of being involved in Philip's assassination, was also not spared. That was the price for standing between Alexander and his destiny. Immediately after securing the throne, Alexander marched southward. The Greek city-states thought that he was still too young, that he could be easily subdued like other immature youths. But they forgot that Alexander had not grown up like an ordinary man. Thebes, a rich and powerful city-state, dared to rise in rebellion. The result was that Alexander erased Thebes from the map in only 2 weeks. The city was completely destroyed. Tens of thousands of citizens were killed or sold into slavery. Those who survived were exiled, a harsh warning to all of Greece. Athens, which had once despised the Macedonians, immediately bowed in submission after witnessing the fall of Thebes. Looking back, many historians believe Alexander was excessively cruel in this matter. But through the eyes of a young king who had just ascended the throne amid countless threats, such cruelty was not merely punishment, it was a declaration. This was not an age of rebellion. This was the age of one single kingdom. Under Alexander's hand, Macedonia had now become a war machine, ready to crush anyone who dared stand in its way. And when the nation was stable, when Greece lay quiet in his grasp, Alexander turned his gaze eastward, toward a name that had terrified the Greek world for 2 centuries: Persia. At the time Alexander took the throne, Persia under King Darius III was the largest empire in the world, stretching from Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, through Mesopotamia, Iraq, Iran, Egypt, and reaching all the way to the borders of India. It was a vast realm spanning 3 continents, home to hundreds of nations, languages, and cultures. For centuries, the Greeks had carried an unending hatred toward Persia, a resentment born from the great wars in which Athens was once burned, and the Greek city-states had to unite in order to defeat the invading armies of Emperor Xerxes. But that hatred had become more than history. It had turned into a symbol of honor, of pride, and also of the unfinished dream of conquest that had once belonged to Philip, Alexander's father. And now, the heir to both the Greek dream and Macedonian ambition stood before an unprecedented opportunity to conquer the greatest empire on earth and to unite the East and the West under a single throne. He did not wait for the right moment. Alexander created the moment himself. In 334 BC, Alexander led his expeditionary army across the Hellespont, known today as the Dardanelles, and advanced into the territory of Persia, specifically into Asia Minor. This was a decisive moment, for with only 40,000 soldiers, including Macedonian infantry, Thessalian cavalry, and Greek mercenaries, Alexander ignited a war that would last 10 years, stretch over 17,000 kilometers, and ultimately bury an entire ancient empire in its ruins. Throughout that journey, he was not merely a general, he was a king carrying within him the ideal of a unified world, though one built through the power of the sword. Alexander's invasion of Persia was not simply a war for territorial expansion. It was a trial by fire, a confrontation between youth and ancient power, between a 20-year-old king and an empire that had endured for more than 2 centuries, where a single mistake could mean the end, not only for him, but for all of Greece, and for the dream of a united world. But Alexander did not hesitate. He entered the enemy's land as if he had already seen his victory reflected in the mirror of destiny. Then came the Battle of the Granicus, his lightning-fast opening strike. In May of 334 BC, the first battle took place on the banks of the Granicus River in northwestern Asia Minor. The Persian forces had gathered a powerful army there to block Alexander's advance. They held the advantage. The river was wide, the banks were steep, their cavalry was skilled, and above all, they believed that no one would dare to attack across such a river. Alexander was advised to wait, but he had not come to wait. He had come to make history. Without a moment's hesitation, he gave the order to attack and cross the river, personally leading the cavalry into the water, charging directly at the enemy waiting on the opposite bank. Spears clashed, shields broke, the thunder of hooves echoed, and blood mixed with the cold water. Alexander narrowly escaped death when a Persian general raised his sword to strike down upon his head, but was saved in the nick of time by one of his bodyguards. Even so, he did not retreat, not a single step. In the end, the Persian army was crushed, thousands were killed, and the entire region of Asia Minor collapsed after just one battle. The world was shaken. A 20-year-old king with only tens of thousands of soldiers had broken through the western gate of the greatest empire of his time. The Battle of Issus, when an emperor fled before a young king. In 333 BC, Alexander advanced deep into the territory of Syria. At this time, Darius III, king of Persia, could no longer remain still. He led a massive army of more than 100,000 men, including Greek mercenaries, cavalry, war chariots, and a vast logistics corps. Alexander had only about 40,000 troops, but he possessed something Darius did not, the absolute loyalty of his soldiers and his personal presence on every meter of the battlefield. The Battle of Issus, on the southern coast of modern-day Turkey, was one of the fiercest battles in history. Darius chose his position cleverly, cutting off Alexander's supply line and forcing him into an unavoidable battle. but Alexander turned the disadvantage into opportunity. While the Persian army became disordered due to the narrow terrain, Alexander struck like lightning, personally leading the cavalry to attack straight into the center, where Darius himself commanded. Each thrust of his spear was a signal to his soldiers, "Strike at the heart, and the head will fall." Darius fled in the midst of the battle, leaving behind his mother, wife, and children, who fell into Alexander's hands. Yet instead of behaving like a conqueror, Alexander treated them with respect, preserving their royal dignity without a single word of insult. He understood that for the peoples of the East, compassion could break resistance faster than the sword. The Battle of Issus was a turning point. It transformed Alexander from a dangerous general into a man who now threatened the very throne of the Persian Empire. A young king who dared to look an emperor in the eyes and made him flee, leaving even his crown behind. The conquest of Egypt, when the conqueror entered the land of the gods and was welcomed as one. On his way toward Persia, Alexander turned south and entered Egypt. There, for the first time, he did not need to use the sword to conquer. Although weakened compared to the golden age of the pyramids and the pharaohs, Egypt still stood as an eternal symbol of divine power, with its magnificent temples, the legendary Nile River, and a civilization revered by both the East and the West. The Egyptians who despised Persian rule opened their gates to welcome him as a liberator. They saw in Alexander not the light of a conqueror, but of a savior. They opened the city gates, offered gifts, and hailed him as a new pharaoh, the son of Amun, the supreme god of Egyptian belief. Alexander, who had long believed himself to be the son of Zeus, accepted this glory as a natural part of his destiny. And just as the Egyptians had hoped, Alexander did not build a military camp, he built a city. That city was Alexandria, the jewel of the ancient world. It was not only an act of power, but a declaration of the future. Alexander was not merely a conqueror, he wanted to create a new civilization, one where Greek thought, Egyptian art, Babylonian science, and Eastern philosophy could meet and blend. And Alexandria was the first point where those great currents came together. He personally drew the layout of the city on the sand, in the shape of a Greek grid, with harbors, squares, temples, libraries, and straight boulevards aligned with the sunrise. Alexandria was not a military outpost, but a capital of knowledge, a symbol of a vision beyond its time. Later, Alexandria became the greatest cultural center of the ancient world, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria and the cradle of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, the seeds that nourished Europe for thousands of years afterward. That city did not die even after Alexander's death. It lived on as if a part of his soul had been carved into the world itself. In Egypt, he visited the temple of Amun at the Siwa oasis, where the priests declared that he was the son of the god, the one chosen to rule all humankind. From that moment, the divine dream within him was no longer something planted by his mother in childhood. It became a political conviction, a faith unshakable, the belief that he was destined to conquer the entire world. The Battle of Gaugamela, the confrontation that decided the fate of an empire. In 331 BC, on the plains of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq, took place the battle that determined the destiny of the ancient world. This time, Darius III did not make mistakes. He prepared the battlefield carefully on flat ground, allowing his war chariots to attack at maximum speed. He mobilized more than 200,000 soldiers, including divisions of war chariots with blades mounted on their sides, weapons that spread terror across the battlefield. Alexander, who was then only 25 years old, had about 47,000 troops. The difference in numbers was absolute, but the difference in strategy was not. Alexander did not attack head-on. He used tactics, sending part of his cavalry to feign movement on the right flank, forcing Darius to shift his troops and expose the center. When the moment came, Alexander struck a swift charge straight into the Persian center, just as he had done at Issus. Once again, Darius fled. But this time, there was no honor left, and no empire to return to. The Persian Empire had lost its capital, its main army, and its prestige. It collapsed only a few months later, when Alexander marched into Babylon. Persepolis, the heart of the Persian Empire, under the red glow of torches, the citadel was burned, the grand throne fell, and the treasures of 1,000 years were plundered. Persia, once the greatest, richest, and most powerful empire on earth, was erased by a 25-year-old king. With the death of Darius III, the ancient Persian Empire that had ruled for more than 2 centuries officially came to an end. Alexander entered the magnificent cities of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the treasure houses of an entire civilization, and declared himself the legitimate successor of the Persian kings. From a Macedonian prince, he had become the king of Asia, ruling from the Nile River to the Indus River, from the Mediterranean Sea to the Himalayan mountains. The world had never before seen an empire so vast, nor a man who stood at such great heights of glory, yet in whose eyes there now began to appear an emptiness. For when he had conquered one world, Alexander began to ask, was it enough? Or must he reach the very border of immortality itself? Ambition had surpassed all limits. Victory had become a burden, and the dream had grown too immense for a mortal heart. After founding Alexandria, the city that bore his name in Egypt, and securing control over all of mighty Persia, Alexander could have stopped. Glory had already reached its peak. The throne had no rival. His name echoed across the entire ancient world. But Alexander was not born to stop. For him, every day that did not reach the edge of the map was a day he had not fully lived his destiny. He was no longer merely a king bearing a sword. He was a man carrying the unfinished map of the world, with a heart still restless for a land farther, deeper, and greater. So he left Egypt, crossed the Iranian plateau, and journeyed through the harsh Hindu Kush mountains, advancing into northwestern India. At that time, no Greek army had ever set foot there. The tropical climate, strange soil, dense jungles, and native kingdoms all were unknowns. But Alexander was never afraid of the unknown. And there, on the banks of the Hydaspes River, now the Jhelum River in Pakistan, he faced the greatest challenge of his life. Opposite him stood King Porus, a powerful ruler of the Aryan people of India, commanding the kingdom of Punjab. Porus did not flee like Darius, nor submit like the Persian lords. He faced Alexander head-on with an elite army armed with a weapon never before seen in battle. War elephants, massive beasts armored in steel, charging through formations and crushing men beneath their feet. On the night before the battle, a torrential rain fell. Everyone thought Alexander would wait. But once again, he acted against all logic, just as he had at Granicus and Issus. He divided his forces, crossed the river in the dark of night, and struck at the weakest point in Porus's formation. The battle raged in the rain, amidst thunder and blood. Elephants roared, horses screamed, soldiers were trampled underfoot. Yet Alexander did not retreat. Though his army suffered heavy losses, he won the battle. King Porus was captured alive. When Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "Treat me as a king." Alexander laughed and answered, "Then you shall be treated as you yourself have asked." He returned the throne to Porus, restored his land, and made him a vassal. For Alexander sought not only territory, he sought loyalty. This victory was the final peak in Alexander's campaign of conquest. But from that moment on, weariness began to spread among his soldiers, a silent rebellion born from exhausted hearts, reaching the limits of human endurance. For nearly 10 years, that army had marched from Europe across Asia, through deserts and rivers, fighting without rest. They were no longer the dreamy Greek youths they once were, but battle-hardened soldiers, weary and worn. They began to ask, how much farther? Where will Alexander stop? Or will he never stop at all? At the river Hyphasis, now known as the Bees River, when Alexander declared his intention to push deeper into the Indian subcontinent, to reach the Ganges River, and to conquer even more eastern kingdoms, the army, for the first time, said no. They did not rebel, they did not turn their backs, they did not riot. They simply fell silent, a heavy, suffocating silence that spread across the camp. It was not a silence of fear, but of exhaustion, a weariness beyond words. Alexander, a man unaccustomed to refusal, sat silently in his tent for days, waiting for someone to change their mind. No one did. He understood. And at last, he gave the order to return. The journey back to Babylon was not a triumphal march. It was a weary retreat, filled with loss and suffering. Thousands of soldiers died of thirst in the Gadrosian desert, or of fever, hunger, and unhealed wounds. When they finally reached Babylon, Alexander was no longer the young man who had ascended the throne at 20. He was an emperor who had traveled nearly 30,000 kilometers, uniting 3 continents, destroying and rebuilding dozens of cities, defeating hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and touching the edge of eternity itself. Yet it was there, in Babylon, as he was preparing even greater plans to build a navy to cross the Arabian Sea, to expand into Spain, and to open a road to China, that he fell ill. A mysterious, lingering fever. Some said it was malaria, others whispered of poison. But the true cause was never known. What was known is that the invincible Alexander on the battlefield could not conquer the fate within his own chest. Lying on his deathbed, under the dim yellow light reflecting off the stone walls of Babylon, he left no clear will. When his generals asked, "Your Majesty, to whom do you leave your empire?" Alexander whispered only, "To the one most worthy." But who was the most worthy? No one knew. That vague answer became the spark that ignited one of the greatest power struggles of the post-ancient world. And then, at the age of 32, Alexander breathed his last in Babylon, the new capital he had planned to make the center of the world. He died without a clear successor, without a detailed testament, and without anyone capable of replacing him. For how could anyone replace a man whom humanity produces only once in thousands of years? Within months of his death, the dream of a united world vanished like smoke. The generals who had fought beside him, the same men who had marched through Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, and Hydaspes, turned against one another. Each pursued his own ambition, his own plan. Thus, the vast empire Alexander had built with blood, intellect, and absolute faith was torn apart like an old cloth among hungry wolves. That era became known as the Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors. Ptolemy seized Egypt and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty. Seleucus took control of most of Asia and established the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus held Macedonia and Greece. None of them possessed Alexander's vision. None commanded the same loyalty he once did. And thus none could maintain an empire that had once cast its shadow over 3 continents. An empire built by a single man could last only as long as that man still lived. As for his death and the mystery that followed, Alexander's body was placed in a solid gold coffin, encased in a jewel-studded sarcophagus, and taken on a journey from Babylon back toward his homeland of Macedonia. But along the way, one of his closest generals intercepted the procession and diverted it to Egypt, understanding that Alexander's remains held a sacred power greater than any treasure. Ptolemy placed Alexander's body in Alexandria, the city that Alexander himself had founded, a way to keep the soul of the empire forever anchored to that land. Crowds came endlessly to pay their respects, as if worshipping a god in human form. And then, over time, the tomb disappeared from history. To this day, no one knows for certain where Alexander's final resting place lies, a king who conquered the entire world, yet whose grave remains one of its greatest mysteries. Still, his name lives on in the cities that bear it. There are more than 20 Alexandrias across Asia and North Africa. His spirit lives in the Hellenistic civilization, where Greek philosophy, science, art, and architecture blended with the spirit of the East to create a brilliant era that lasted for centuries. In Egypt, Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria, where Euclid laid the foundations of geometry, where Galen and Hipparchus advanced ancient medicine and astronomy. Alexander was not merely a conqueror. He was a bridge between civilizations, the first man to dream of a world united not by borders or blood, but by knowledge, tolerance, and the pursuit of greatness. Alexander, a military genius or a man consumed by power. More than 2,300 years have passed since Alexander the Great drew his final breath in Babylon. Questions about him remain an unresolved mystery, full of controversy in human history. Alexander, the legendary king, the lord of the ancient world, was he truly the great symbol of genius and idealism, or merely a man so obsessed with power that he turned the entire planet into a chessboard and himself into its final pawn? It cannot be denied that Alexander was a rare military genius, a man who broke the might of empires that the ancient world once feared. He understood the battlefield like a mathematician, read the hearts of his soldiers like a psychologist, and led men with an unmatched instinct. But one cannot ignore another truth. Every step he took was marked by blood. Every land he conquered meant thousands losing their homes, their loved ones, their very purpose of life. He brought the light of Greece to Western Asia and North Africa, sowed the seeds of Hellenistic civilization, founded great centers of knowledge like Alexandria, and opened an era of dialogue between East and West. Yet those same seeds were watered with the blood and tears of millions who had once lived in peace before his armies arrived. What does it mean to conquer the entire world if that very world collapses the moment you die? This question does not belong only to Alexander. It belongs to all those who climb to the summit of power, to those who dream of creating a new order, but fail to leave behind a lasting foundation. Alexander died at the age of 32, leaving behind an empire larger than imagination itself. But he left no system of governance, no mechanism of succession, and no framework of laws that others could carry on. And so, that empire collapsed just months after his death. Vassals rebelled. Generals fought for power. The cities that bore his name turned into battlefields. Never before in human history had one man left behind a legacy so vast, yet so fragile. The question is not what Alexander accomplished, but what he truly left behind. How long did those glories endure? And was that truly victory, or merely a dazzling illusion that hid a cold truth? That power itself cannot outlive death. Alexander, the radiance of immortality, and also one of the most tragic figures in all of human history. Perhaps no one else in history has lived such a short life, yet left such a long and deep shadow. Alexander the Great, called the king of the ancient world, the greatest conqueror, the embodiment of military genius, the symbol of transcendent will that broke the limits of humanity. In just over a decade, he rose from a young Macedonian prince to the ruler of 3 continents. From the philosophical glory of Athens to the sacred lands of Egypt, across the might of Persia, and to the far reaches of India, all lay beneath the hooves of his horse, a glory unmatched in the history of mankind. But for that very reason, Alexander stands as the clearest proof of the eternal tragedy of those who seek to possess the entire world. He was too young to understand that power cannot be immortal without a structure to sustain it. He was too consumed by conquest to realize that he had driven his army to the brink of exhaustion and despair. He built an empire vast beyond measure, yet failed to build a future after his own death. When he died, the empire immediately collapsed, and the cities that bore his name became the battlegrounds of generals who had once sworn loyalty to him, and bitterly his body, worshipped as that of a god, eventually vanished into the dust of history. No trace remains, no certain resting place for future generations to bow in remembrance. Alexander was a brilliant flash of lightning across the night sky of history, dazzling, magnificent, but fleeting, leaving behind an echo that never fades. He is immortal in legend, yet tragic in truth. His death was not only the end of a man, but the death of a dream, of a unified world where East and West met, where strength was guided by idealism. And so Alexander, who went farther than all, who rose higher than all, was also the one who fell with the deepest loneliness of all, a blinding light, yet also the longest, heaviest silence in the grand symphony of human history. Ladies and gentlemen, history is never just what has passed. It is a mirror that reflects the present, a voice from the past that speaks to our generation today. And Alexander, the brightest legend of the ancient world, is one of those timeless warnings. Even today there are many who dream of domination, of limitless power, of engraving their names upon every land. But do they ever ask, when they are gone, will all they built continue to live, or turn to ashes at the very height of their glory? History does not teach us how to become Alexander. It reminds us that even Alexander could not escape the fall of an empire built without a lasting foundation, and that true greatness lies not in how many cities one builds or how much land one conquers, but in whether, after we are gone, anyone still believes in the ideals we once pursued. Because in the end, what remains is not power, but legacy. Not the blinding light of glory, but the enduring light that survives from it. Thank you for staying until the very end of this journey, where legend and tragedy share the same name, Alexander. If you found this story meaningful, Please share it so that others may reflect upon it. And don't forget to follow the channel to continue discovering more hidden corners of history, where light and shadow always walk side by side. See you again in the next video.